Javier Milei, Argentina's Ron Paul, just won the election. So does this mean Argentina is going to have an economic boom or economic bust? And could this be a perfect time to invest in Argentina and make a killing? I'm going to do my very best to answer those questions for you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over one of Javier's main policy proposals, and that is to slash government spending. He is so serious about cutting government spending. He was going on the campaign trail with a chainsaw. True story. So he's really serious about reducing the size of government. So let's start by looking at this kind of from a 30,000 foot level. A lot of you would jump to the conclusion, myself included, that less government spending is a good thing. But why? Let's look at this using actual data. So we start by looking at a chart going back to 2008 to 2023. On the left, we go from 0% up to 150%. This is M2 money supply in the United States. And you can see since 2008, it's grown by about 150%. Here we have a chart that looks very similar. In fact, this chart shows M2 money supply going up by the exact same, 150%. But there's a catch. You see, this is not from 2008 to 2023, but it is another 15-year period in American history. That would be from 1880 to 1895. You heard correctly. M2 money supply grew the exact same from 2008 to 2023 with all the QE and money printer go burr as it did under the gold standard from 1880 to 1895. Now, why that happened is a topic for a completely separate video. But my point is to illustrate 2 key metrics. Number 1 would be the inflation rate during this 15-year period, compounded about 50%. So prices rose in the United States, as the government would admit to, by 50%. But notice what happened from 1880 to 1895 when you had the exact same increase in M2 money supply growth. Prices did not go up. They went down by 35%. You say, well, George, let's look at nominal GDP. Okay, fine. Here, we have an increase of 100%. And you say, George, well, there you go. You see, we're far more efficient today with modern technology, and that's why nominal GDP went up by 100% more recently, and way back in the 1800s, it only went up by 35%. Yes, this is what your friend and family member Fred is saying right about now as they're watching this video. But your friend and family member Fred has most likely never used a real GDP calculator. In other words, GDP adjusted for inflation. So when you do that, it tells a much different story. So real GDP, which is what we should be concerned with because that's a measurement of actual economic output, 2008, 2023, approximately 33%. Those aren't exact numbers, but it's very close. From 1880 to 1895, 100%. So it's a little confusing, but it actually makes sense if you think about it. If you only have 35% nominal GDP growth, but prices go down by 35%, that's actually very close to 100% real GDP growth, which again is what we're most concerned with. And if you have 100% nominal GDP with 50% inflation, that's only growth of 33%. So then the next question becomes, okay, well, if money supply is the exact same, and why on earth was inflation so dramatically different? And you have these different metrics here. Well, I've done a lot of research on this, and the one common denominator that I see that would explain this massive difference would be this number right here. Total government spending as a percentage of GDP. Now, hopefully you guys can see where I'm going with this. Right here, we've got about 50% government spending in 2023 as a percentage of GDP when you include state, local, and federal. But way back in the 1800s, we did not have 50% of GDP coming from the inefficiencies of government spending. In fact, we only had about 5%. So think about it this way. 95% of the entire economy was in the private sector back in the 1800s or during this time frame, when only 50% more recently. So which economy do you think is going to produce more goods and services? Which economy do you think is going to be more efficient? Which economy do you think is going to produce more wealth? It's the economy with less government spending as a percentage of GDP. So in his first proposal, I would give Javier an A+. Let me be very clear. Throughout this entire video, I'm going to be assuming that he can go ahead and enact all of these objectives that he was talking about on the campaign trail. That's first and foremost. And second, regarding this step, we have to realize over the long run, all else being equal, the probability is very high that slashing government spending would give a huge tailwind to economic growth. But in the short term, it would be devastating. So the question becomes, does the Argentinian public have enough patience with Javier Milei to give him enough time to slash that spending, GDP goes straight down, but then reap the benefits over the long run? We'll have to wait and find out. Step number 2, dollarize the economy. There are some obvious benefits right up front, such as this would eliminate inflation almost overnight, definitely limit the size of government, but there's another benefit that nobody is talking about. Very few people have thought this through, and I'm going to reveal it to you right now. So let's start by looking at this flow of water. We've got a faucet right here. We've got kind of a bucket that's accumulating the water, and then we have a drain. You may be saying to yourself, George, what on earth does this have to do with Argentina dollarizing? Well, let me give you some visuals. And before we move any further, I need to give a huge shout out and thank you, a hat tip, to my good buddy Brent Johnson, who actually texted me these visuals just the other day. So let's assume this bucket filling up with water is the US economy. And these larger buckets down here represent the global economy. All right, well, most of you know the banking system in the United States is creating currency units, and I don't really think the Fed is part of the monetary system. I did a video on that the other day, but at certain points in time, they can impact M2. So you've got all these dollars that are being created that are going into the US economy. Let's say $10 in total right now, or $10 has accumulated because you have dollars flowing in and being created, but then you also have dollars leaving through the drain at the bottom. Well, how would dollars leave the US economy? Well, through things like the trade deficit. So what happens is when we import goods, we export dollars. So those dollars are going out to countries like China that produce the stuff that you buy at Home Depot, Walmart, Target, etc. So this represents the money that's flowing out of the United States, the trade deficit. And again, this faucet represents the amount of currency units that are being created that are circulating or going into this bucket of dollars that are circulating within the real economy, and that is $10. All right, we all on the same page? Good. Now let's assume that our trade deficit right now is $1. That's flowing into the global economy. But the global economy uses a lot of dollars. 60 or 70% of the transactions are settled in the green piece of paper itself, or an electronic representation of a green piece of paper. Very important distinction. So let's assume for a moment that there's $100 trillion, or actually just $100 in the global economy. The majority of these dollars were lent into existence by those banks in the shadows. We call that the euro dollar system. So let's just assume for the sake of this example that 100% of the dollars are lent into existence. Well, that means that there would be $100 of dollar-denominated debt. Why is this important? Because that represents demand for dollars. Think about it. If you've got a $500,000 mortgage right now as we speak, well, that's a liability on your balance sheet. That's an asset on the bank's balance sheet. But it also represents $500,000 of demand because you've got to come up with those 500,000 currency units in order to pay back the bank before you can own your house free and clear. It's the exact same thing in the global monetary system. So the argument is always the BRICS countries are coming out with their new gold-backed currency, and Saudi Arabia is going to get rid of the petrodollar. So the demand for dollars outside the United States is going to go down dramatically, and all those dollars, or a lot of them, are going to flow right back into the United States. So if we started with 100, let's just assume for a moment that $50 go back into the United States. So now there's $60 circulating here. Well, if you're thinking to yourself that would create consumer price inflation in the United States, you're right. But that is a topic for a separate video. So the main thing that I want to focus on here is the fact that the amount of dollars outside the United States just got cut in half. Okay, well, what happened to the demand for dollars? It went down a little, but the demand for dollars, as far as this dollar-denominated debt, didn't change. It's still $100. So if we think through the supply-demand dynamics here, we have the same demand, but yet half the supply. So what happens to the value of the dollar relative to other currencies? Well, if demand is twice the supply, then the value would skyrocket. It'd go straight up. And let's remember that although there is supply of dollars coming out of the United States, it's only a dollar because it's limited to the trade deficit. So if these $50 go into the US, very few of them are going to be able to come back out into the global economy. Now, I know a lot of you are saying right about now, they're really thinking this through. You got your thinking caps on and you're paying attention. You're saying, okay, George, well, if the $50 don't go back into the United States, let's just say that Saudi Arabia has those on their balance sheet. They no longer want them. So they sell them into the global economy to buy something else, like the new BRICS currency or gold or commodities or whatever it is. Okay, fine. Well, let's go through that thought experiment. So understanding that the majority, or in this case 100%, of the dollars outside of the United States were lent into existence. What that means is demand for dollars basically controls the supply of dollars. Let me show you what I'm referring to. So Saudi Arabia sells those $50 into the marketplace, but someone buys them. Well, that person's not going to want them, right? Because no one wants these dollars anymore, but they still have the debt. So what they're going to do with those $50 is they're going to pay back the debt they owe to the bank. Just like if you had $500,000 that you didn't want anymore, the first thing you'd probably do is pay back that $500,000 mortgage so you could own your home free and clear. So if $50 of debt is paid off, now it gets cut in half. That's true. But what would happen to the amount of dollars? It would get cut in half as well. Because if these currency units were created by lending them into existence, when that loan is paid off, the currency units are destroyed. They no longer exist. So to make sure that we're all on the same page, let's take it to an extreme. Let's say the demand for the greenback went down to 0 outside the United States. Well, that means that 100%, all $100 of debt gets paid off, and that means that all $100 that exist disappear. And the amount of USD outside America, the good old US of A, drops straight down to 0. So one of the main reasons dollarizing would benefit Argentina is because over the long run, it would give it a currency that's likely going to be very stable because of the way the global monetary system is currently set up. Meaning that there's a very low probability that we see huge imbalances in the supply-demand dynamics for the dollar in the global economy. And if this is the case, then Argentina is going to be able to leverage that currency that is very stable relative to the currency of Argentina's trading partners. Step number 3, end the Fed, or the Central Bank of Argentina. We'll just use the Fed because that's the central bank that most of us are familiar with. But this is a fantastic idea. I see very little downside here, even in the short term. But to truly understand how this would impact the Argentinian economy long term, or any economy that got rid of their central bank and the central planners altogether, we have to realize that the central bank, or let's say the Fed, doesn't control anything. We'll put a line through it just to give you that visual. They don't control interest rates. They don't control money. They don't control the supply of money. But what they do is distort the economy through the decisions that people make because they believe that the Fed actually controls these things such as rates and liquidity. Let me show you what I'm referring to. Actually, before we even go to the visual, I'd like to point out some of the data points that we reviewed on the last whiteboard video, where I talked about how the Federal Reserve really isn't a participant in the monetary system. They're more of an observer. But a couple quick thought experiments that you can do is just look at the reserves in the system on the Fed's balance sheet between 1980 and 2007, when M2 money supply went from 1.5 trillion up to 7.5 trillion, and reserves flatlined. They didn't go up at all. So if there was truly demand for bank reserves, meaning if the Fed created liquidity, if the Fed controlled liquidity, then how on earth can reserves flatline? The answer is that would be impossible. If M2 went from 1.5 trillion to 7.5 trillion, by the way, when Fed funds at the same time went from 15% down to 5%, and they were supposed to control interest rates by controlling liquidity, then you would have to see the amount of reserves in the system go way higher from 80 to 2007, and we didn't. And what this proves unequivocally is the banks don't need those reserves because they create their own liquidity. But for some reason, people think that the Fed, right here, we're gonna get to Jerome Powell in a minute, is almighty and they micromanage everything. Another quick thought experiment that I'd throw out there is just go back a year or so when the CPI was at 9% to just ask yourself where the 10-year Treasury would have been if interest rates, the Fed funds, would have stayed at 0%. I think most of you, if you actually think about it, would argue that the 10-year Treasury yield would be higher than it was, not lower. So there again, how is the Fed controlling rates? We could look at QE 1, 2, 3. Interest rates are supposed to go down on the 10-year. They went up. Still not convinced? Let's look at some more proof. Editor, let's go ahead and throw up a chart of the 10-year Treasury yield back in 2004, right around 4.5%. Very similar to where it is today. But I'd like to remind you that Fed funds in 2004 was 1%. Today it's over 5%. So it's just not possible to argue that the Fed can control interest rates with this laser precision that for some reason we all think they do. So in reality, the Fed is very similar to one of these Native American witch doctors or the chief that could do the rain dance. When they needed it to rain, when they needed some bumper crops, that all he would have to do is come out and do his little dance a little bit and go around the fire, and oh my gosh, the clouds would come on in, you'd see the lightning, the thunder, and it would just start pouring rain and all the corn would grow and everyone's happy, right? The people back then truly believed that that guy wearing the headdress over there could control when it rains and when it doesn't. And it's the exact same thing with the Fed and the central bank. And we're going to tie this right back to Argentina by going through this visual. So right here, we've got this guy that looks suspiciously like Jerome Powell. And he's wearing this headdress. He's the guy in the tribe or whatever it's called that does the rain dance. And he comes in and tells everybody that I make much rain. So this year, this season, it's really going to pour. So you've got all the farmers. We'll call this guy Farmer Tonto. And Farmer Tonto listens to the rain dance guy and he says, wow, He said he is going to make much rain. So therefore, I need to prepare because I'm going to be able to grow a lot more corn. I'm going to be able to raise more cows, and I'm going to be able to grow a lot more cotton. So he takes all of his savings. Let's just assume for a moment that the money that they're using are copper coins. Why, you may ask? Because I don't have a yellow pen to draw gold up here, so we'll just have to stick with the copper. So Tonto takes all of his copper, all of his life savings, because he really thinks it's going to rain, because this guy's going to get out there and do his jig. So he goes down to the local home improvement store. We'll call it we're not going to call it Home Depot. Are you crazy? He goes down to the local TP Depot and he buys all the stuff that he needs for all of this rain that's coming his way. He buys more fertilizer, he buys feed, and he buys the tools to really take advantage of this harvest. But then the season comes and it passes. And instead of having much rain, they just kind of have average rain. So then we fast forward to the next scene in our story, and Tonto is pissed. He's bummed out because he was only able to grow one piece of cotton, one bushel of corn, if that's what it's called, and he's only able to grow one cow, however that works. So he takes his stuff, sells it into the market, but he only gets 2 copper coins in return. So he actually loses money. But that's not all. He actually creates malinvestment and a misallocation of resources because he incorrectly thought that this guy could control the amount of rain. But if we could shift over into a parallel universe where there was no rain dance witch doctor guy, and let's just say that Tonto had to use common sense and actual data from history to determine how much it would rain, well, he would not have taken his life savings to go down to TP Depot. He would have taken maybe 2 copper coins and bought an appropriate amount of feed and the tool, and he would not have bought more fertilizer. So not only would he be better off, he would have more savings, but TP Depot would have that fertilizer that Tonto wasted on planting additional crops because he thought it was going to rain. So you see what happens is Tonto's better off because he has more coins, and society at large is better off because those scarce resources weren't wasted. So the moral of the story here is, did the witch doctor guy control rain? Absolutely not. But he definitely distorted the economy. And it's the exact same thing the Federal Reserve does, and it's the exact same thing all central banks do, including the Central Bank of Argentina. But let's just assume for a moment that you actually think the central planners control interest rates, and they control money, and they control liquidity. Okay, that's fine. Are we really going to argue that central planning is better than the free market? Of course not. The free market is always greater than central planning. So why would we not want the free market to set the most important price of all? And that is the price of money. In other words, interest rates. So is Argentina going to experience an economic boom or an economic bust? And is now a great time or a bad time to invest in Argentina? Well, I think short term, they could go through some economic pain if Javier is able to implement these policies. But long term, all else being equal, if he's able to maintain the rule of law, etc., I think Argentina will benefit in a massive way. And I look forward to seeing how this plays out, not just from a standpoint of curiosity, but more so how this can benefit the poor and middle class and really raise their standard of living. And as far as it being an investment opportunity, for that I would have to defer to the professionals. I just did a deep dive analysis on Argentina with my good friend Chris McIntosh, hedge fund manager, who's been investing in Argentina for the last 2 or 3 years. We also talk about how right now you can get your tickets to Rebel Capitalist Live at a discount. We got a Thanksgiving special going on. So if you want to see that deep dive, click on this video right here. And if you want to get your discounted tickets to the next Rebel Capitalist Live, you can check out rebelcapitalistlive.com.